detected. That way. 횡단 mall. city, do you think?
Well, I don't think it's a crass question at all. I mean, I personally think when we come to, not at all. I mean, when we come to strategic issues, military issues, the best questions are the simplest ones, to be honest. The details are sometimes complex. So I think it's a really critical question. And my interpretation is, I think it's a massive deal on every single level. I mean, Kherson is a provincial capital. It's been taken back. Putin 2 months ago declared it part of Russian territory. It's been taken back, but also really interestingly, it's been taken back in a manner that I think, you pointed to your optimism, and I agree. I think there's some optimistic things. Two things. One, I thought it would be fought for quite intensely. Yeah. I thought that's what the Russians would prepare for. But clearly, there was a complete collapse of morale and logistics within the city, forcing Surovikin to withdraw his troops. And the other thing about it is, if you remember about 6 weeks, a month ago, there was a very strange phone call between Shergoy and Austin Lloyd and Ben Wallace, the respective foreign secretaries and Secretary of State for Britain and the US, saying, the Ukrainians put a dirty bomb into Kherson. And that seemed to preface that they were going to use some nefarious chemical techniques to keep the Ukrainians out. Nothing's happened, not transpired. So the escalation that people have been worried about, and I've been worried about, hasn't happened. So what I suggest is a really significant moment. I mean, if you look at the war over the last 9 months, there's been key moments: failure in Kyiv, counterattack in Kherson and around Kharkiv, and then this is is a really huge moment. It's sort of a punctuating point of this phase of the counterattack. So it is huge. You're absolutely right.
So for Zelensky to call it the beginning of the end of the war is I mean, he's not really been one for hyperbole, has he? Since it all started, and he's certainly, under this analysis, he's not leaning towards hyperbole now.
No, I mean, now this is interesting because it depends, obviously we're now interpreting what he means. Now, does he mean it's the end of the war, like the Russians will be rolled up across Zaporizhia province and down into Crimea, and the Ukrainian forces will retake the whole of the Donbass? I think that's probably what he means, and therefore, at this point, it probably is a rather more rhetorical device. But the other interesting thing to note here is General Milley, the the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who earlier on last week was saying about a potential negotiated settlement. I don't think the Zelensky regime is going to be, the Zelensky government and their forces are going to be remotely interested in that at this point. But it's not going to be, this is a decisive phase. There's still a lot of fighting to be done, and I think it's still going to be very difficult over the winter for the advance to continue at the pace that it has in September. So I think, in terms of the beginning and I don't know. I'm more sceptical, I've got to say, I'm afraid.
I understand. I mean, and I'm interested in this as well. I think for amateurs watching, we kind of felt, after the relative debacle of the initial moves upon Kiev and the failure to take it at all, never mind in the 2 or 3 days that the Russians expected, I think that some of us have been sort of waiting for the Russian resurgence, just because of the way that we've been informed over the years, or the impression that we had of the Russian military machine, for all its flaws. I just expected at some point Russia to come out with all guns blazing, to use a figure of speech. The longer this goes on, and the more events there are like the Kherson story, the less likely. I mean, would you say now that there's no prospect of Russia coming out with an epic and successful offensive? It's just it's now attrition. Yeah. It's attrition and unfolding defensive.
Completely. I mean, I think the point about it is that the Russians. I mean, the figures vary, but let's say the Russians have lost 40,000 troops dead, 120,000 wounded. So that is 50% of the professional, kind of quasi-professional conscript army they had going into the war. Well, basically, the general figures in military history is that you lose about between 15 and 25%, absolutely 30% of your combat forces. You can't attack anymore. I mean, it's an enduring, in sort of films, we have this thing of people attack and the unit is completely decimated. That's not reality. The reality is a unit takes 30% casualties, it becomes ineffective, combat ineffective, it can't attack. And the Russian forces have exceeded those kinds of losses, and therefore I agree. I think that a Russian counter-strike, there's little nibbles around Bakhmut, the Wagner group is making little micro-attacks, which are extraordinary to me. But I think the days of a Russian major counter-offensive, they are trying to hold the line. And in fact, morale, logistics, the command organisation is so poor, they're struggling to hold the line along the Krasny River line around Svatory. So, absolutely, I think the issue now, and this comes back to the point about Zelensky and his pronouncement, I mean, the fulcrum of the campaign has moved, and it's a question now of how much Ukraine is prepared to take before they're interested in negotiation, and how much are their Western backers interested in supporting them to that negotiated settlement. I mean, personally, obviously being a slight pessimist, but I think it's going to be a longer struggle. I think the winter's going to be tough. I think the lines are likely to stabilise along the Dnipro River and more or less where they are in the Donbass. Probably, the Ukrainians might take Svatory, but I think we're in for a kind of slow attrition. The Russians don't want to give up, even though their armed forces have been absolutely decimated.
Thank you, Anthony, as ever. So, in fact, my final question was going to be, what should we look out for next? But you've just answered that in a way, haven't you, by saying not a lot, really.
Well, I don't want to preempt your questions, but yeah, I mean, that's where I think we're looking a sort of stabilisation over the winter, and then something probably next spring, I think, if Zelensky wants to push it forward.
We shall see. Professor Anthony King, Chair of War Studies at the University of Warwick, thank you as ever. That's it from me for today. Don't forget that you can catch up with the show at Global Player, where you'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as the world's biggest podcasts, notably mine, full disclosure. So do download Global Player for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4, but now it's time for Sangeeta Maiska.
Thank you, James. Former First Lady Michelle Obama says she feels insecure about her looks and finds it hard to be kind to herself. If she suffers from imposter syndrome, what hope do we have? What is it, and do you have it? That's after 3. At 2, customers could be owed millions of pounds in compensation by water companies for failing to control sewage leaks, according to one law firm. Isn't it just time we renationalised water companies altogether? But first, union bosses say a deal must be found to end NHS strikes ahead of this winter as they meet with the Health Secretary today. Given waiting lists are at a record high and some patients have waited 12 hours for an ambulance, is winter really the right time to strike, or is it irresponsible?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 1 o'clock, an inquest has heard a 2-year-old boy died as a result of living in a mouldy flat in Greater Manchester. Awab Ishaq died after suffering from a breathing condition in December 2020. His family had previously complained about the mould to their housing association in Rochdale. LBC's Liam Gotting in Manchester has more.
The coroner said Awab's cardiac arrest was entirely due to the prolonged exposure he had to mould in his home environment, adding the property did not have adequate ventilation and was not equipped for day-to-day living activities, which led to excess damp and condensation.
Rishi Sunak has admitted the UK's international reputation has taken a knock in recent weeks, but the Prime Minister refused to apologise for what he called mistakes which were made by the previous Conservative government. Speaking while at the G20 summit in Bali, he said things have already improved.
I think it's really important that people understand actually what's happened since I became Prime Minister and over the last few weeks is we've actually seen all those UK-specific factors in terms of how much we borrow, what's happened to the pound. Those have all considerably improved, and what we're now facing are the same challenges that many of the countries here are facing as well.
He's promised fairness and compassion from the Chancellor during this week's autumn statement. The UK's unemployment rate has increased slightly to 3.6% in the 3 months to September. That's up from 3.5% in the previous quarter. A rise in wages continues to be outstripped by inflation, with real-term average earnings down 3.8%. The Health Secretary says talks will continue with unions representing NHS. The Royal College of Nursing has already voted for strike action over pay, and several other groups have been balloting their members. Steve Barclay says he reiterated his admiration for healthcare workers and his door remains open. And England are on their way to the World Cup in Qatar after being visited by the Prince of Wales earlier. William presented each member of the squad with their shirts, saying we're all rooting for you. Wales are also making their way to the country today ahead of the tournament starting on Sunday. In the city, a short time ago, the FTSE 100 was unchanged at 73.85. The pound buys $1.19 and €1.13. LBC weather, blustery rain pushing eastwards for most, clearing later from the southwest to leave sunshine and sharp showers, sunny and dry in Northern Ireland, a high of 14 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
If you're worried that your mortgage payments could go up, it's helpful to know that you can arrange to switch your Barclays mortgage up to 180 days before your current one ends. One way you can do this is in the Barclays app. Your new rate will then apply as soon as your existing rate expires. Simple. For more money help, including other ways to switch your mortgage, search Barclays Cost of Living. Barclays. Make money work for you. Subject to application, financial circumstances and borrowing history. T's and C's apply. 18+. Your home may be repossessed if you do not keep up repayments on your mortgage.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Sangeeta Maiska.
afternoon. I'm Sangeeta Maiska here with you until 4 o'clock. I'm sitting in for Sheila Fogarty this week. My usual home on LBC is actually this time across the weekend. So if you want to join me there, you're more than welcome. Loads and loads to talk about today. So I'm going to get stuck straight in. Just want to flag up what's happening at 2 o'clock. I want to discuss water companies in England with you. The reason is I came across this really interesting article it was in The Guardian, I think, in which a law firm, and actually a big one, leading one, has its own economist, that big, says that customers in England may be owed millions of pounds in compensation. Why? Because water companies in England have failed so miserably to stem sewage spills. So they're trying to get a case together to sue them. The thing is, as I was doing up my shoes this morning, getting the umbrella out for the rain, I just thought, what is the point of litigation? Why don't we just renationalise the water companies? Why don't we renationalise the water companies? Is there an argument that's strong enough to do that? Well, Fergal Sharkey will be joining me at 2 o'clock. He, of course, is now the environmental campaigner. He has very strong views on this. 2 o'clock. My question to you, should the water companies be renationalised? 0345 6060 973, that at 2. But first, I want to take you to what I think is probably the biggest story of the day, the most significant story of the day. Why? Because almost all of us will have used the health service at some point, if not as I am speaking to you. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has met the leaders of the union at the Royal College of Nursing and other major NHS unions, including Unison, GMB and Unite. The latter three are all balloting over industrial action. You and I know that the nurses have now voted to take strike action. Now, Stephen Barclay was briefing the papers that this isn't a meeting all about strike action, it's actually about workforce plan. But you and I know that these two things are very closely related, because every single time I talk to a nurse or a healthcare worker, they will say to me, one of the big pressures on them, it's not just money, it's actually about conditions. And when it comes to nurses, it's about the fact there are 47,000 unfilled vacancies, and that is hugely problematic, because what it means is those people that are left over in the NHS are having to take on more work. So we know that, don't we? We also know that although funding in actual terms has gone up very, very slightly year on year, in real terms it's falling, and capital spends up.
Striking for better pay and staffing later this winter. So these are really, really serious times. And what the Secretary of State heard from all of the unions was an absolute open door on our part to resolving this dispute. We want to work with the government to avert a damaging dispute, but health workers have reached the end of their tether. Key workers in health, the issues that you were talking about, that everybody who has been a patient will have experienced, these are issues that have prevailed for over a year now. This staffing crisis did not come out of the blue. It's not, as a result of COVID. This has been building over the last decade, and we have been trying it the government's way for a decade now, with underinvestment in staffing, with below inflation pay rises every year, with cutting corners, with removing the training funds for junior health staff and for nurses in training, and that has led us to the state we're in that you described so well today. So whether you are the patient waiting in pain to be seen for an operation, for elective surgery, whether you are somebody who is trying to juggle a rota and organise the staff in your team when you've got people missing every single day, or whether you're the paramedic waiting with somebody in your ambulance for 7, 8, 9, 10 hours because there aren't enough staff and beds in order to take people into A&E when people arrive. You know, it is in all of our interest to try a new tack, and that means investing in the NHS workforce. So what all unions there were giving a clear message to the Secretary of State and the Minister was we are always happy to talk about the broad staffing issues. We know there are issues other than pay that we want to address. However, all roads lead back to Rome, and the pay situation, we know that low pay is driving people out of the health service, and the conclusion of report after report, not just trade union advice, but independent experts across the range of different health think tanks, select committee report after select committee report, all point to the need to stop people leaving as a key action before we can start to restore confidence.
Can I ask you about something? Because Stephen Barclay